His horse stood outside her cabin like a vulture waiting for the last breath. $31,000 in debt, 2 weeks before the sheriff would throw her dying father into the street. Then a stranger rode up with an impossible offer. "I need a wife. You need money. Marry me tomorrow, and every penny of your family's debt disappears." She had never seen him before that morning. She didn't even know his real name. But she said yes. And married him before the sun was fully up. What she didn't know, the poor mountain man was hiding a fortune, and a family war that would drag her into the most dangerous fight of her life. Was she a desperate fool, or the smartest woman in the territory? Stay until the end. The answer will surprise you. Sometimes the scariest leap of faith leads you exactly where you were meant to be, but only if you're brave enough to jump. True strength isn't waiting for rescue. It's making impossible choices and building something beautiful from the wreckage. If you believe women write their own destiny, you belong here. Hit subscribe and join our community. Tell me in the comments, would you have said yes to a stranger? And if this story speaks to you, share it with someone who needs courage today. His horse stood outside their little cabin like a vulture waiting for the last breath. Lydia watched him from the window, knowing he was there to ruin what was left of her family. The disarray of her parents' wedding day showed her mother's bright eyes and unguarded smile. That woman was gone, replaced by a brittle thing made of worry. "How much time did Mr. Garrett give us?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. 2 weeks, maybe 3? Her mother's silence was answer enough. Her father's room smelled of sickness and defeat. Thomas Hale lay against old pillows, his breathing a painful rasp. At 43, he looked 70. "Lydia, girl," he whispered, his grip surprisingly strong. "I heard Garrett. I failed you. I built a life that turned out to be nothing but dust and debt." Lydia held his hand tight, her own heart breaking. But she refused to cry. Tears were a luxury they just could not afford. He squeezed her hand. "You always were a terrible liar. But I love you for trying." Outside, Garrett's voice cut right through the thin walls. "I am sorry, Mrs. Hale, but sympathy does not pay the bills. The bank wants its money one way or another." Her mother pleaded for more time. "Time is exactly what you do not have," Garrett said flatly. That was it for Lydia. She stood up and marched into the main room. Garrett turned, his eyes sizing her up like she was livestock for sale. She hated that look more than anything in the world. "How much?" Lydia asked, her voice as cold as iron. Garrett gave a nasty smile and pulled out his ledger. $31,742, plus the interest, of course. The number was a punch to the gut, an impossible mountain they could never climb. "If you cannot pay," Garrett continued, snapping his book shut, "I will be back on the 15th with a sheriff's order. You will have until sundown to get out." He tipped his hat in a mocking farewell. Just as despair began to settle in like a cold fog, a second horse approached, its steps slow and steady. A tall man from the mountains dismounted and walked right up to their door. Lydia opened the door to a man with watchful gray eyes. He was weathered but not old, and he held himself with a quiet strength. "Miss Hale?" he asked. "My name is Ethan Crow. I have a proposition for you." He stepped inside but did not sit, choosing to stand with his back to the wall. "I will be direct," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on Lydia. "I need a wife. Your family needs money. I am prepared to pay off all your debts in exchange for your hand in marriage." The room went completely silent. Before her mother could even protest, Ethan pulled out a bank draft. He handed it to Lydia. It was made out for $40,000, more than enough to save their home and their lives. "You will marry me and live at my place up in the hills." The bank draft for $400 sat on the table, more money than Lydia had ever seen. "Why buy a wife?" she asked, her voice steady. "Surely you could find someone." A flicker of a smile touched Ethan's lips. I prefer a clear arrangement. No false hopes. And what do you expect? She pressed. He said he needed a partner, someone to run a home who understood some things are worth more than $1. Her mother, Margaret, was horrified. Lydia, no, this is madness. But Lydia's gaze never left Ethan's. Is it more mad than losing everything we own? She countered. I have to see your home first. I will not go in blind. After a long pause, Ethan nodded. Fair enough. It is a remote place, but you will want for nothing. I am looking for a partner, Miss Hale, not a hired hand. A partner in what? Lydia asked. In survival, he replied, in building something to last. He left the draft on the table. You have until tomorrow evening. If you agree, meet me at the North Crossroads at dawn, day after tomorrow. Her mother cut in. And the money? It is hers if she agrees. The debt is paid regardless. I keep my word. Before he left, Lydia had one more question. Why me? His face softened just a bit. Because I saw you stand up to Samuel Garrett. Desperation has made you sharp, and I need someone sharp. He was gone, leaving them with the draft and a terrible choice. That night, Margaret paced the small cabin. You cannot do this, Lydia. Marriage is not a transaction. It has been for centuries, Mama, Lydia said, her eyes fixed on the paper. At least this way I know what the terms are. You know nothing, her mother cried. He could be our only chance. Her father, Thomas, called them to his bedside, his voice weak but clear. I will not be here to see how this story ends, he said, his eyes filled with a feverish light. So I will speak my mind now. He took Lydia's hand. You are 22, and you have sacrificed everything for this family. I do not know this man, but I know you. I trust your judgment. Lydia then looked at her crying mother. This is not giving up, Mama. This is choosing the only real path we have. It is better than waiting for a miracle that will not come. Margaret whispered, But what if he harms you? Then I will leave, Lydia promised. The debt will be paid regardless. Her father gave one last piece of advice. If you go, be smart. Keep some money back. Learn the land. Make yourself so valuable he cannot do without you. A deal's a deal. He's paying for her hand, not her soul, Thomas said. His wife, Margaret, looked shocked, but his dying words were practical. He was teaching Lydia to survive. The next day was a blur. Lydia packed one bag, just like Ethan Crow told her. She chose her mother's sewing kit, her father's watch, and a few practical things. News travels fast in a small town. A neighbor, Sarah Mitchell, came by, fishing for gossip. You really marrying that mountain hermit, Ethan Crow? She asked. Folks say he's hiding from something, or maybe sitting on a pile of gold. Lydia just said, They're just stories, Sarah. Later, her mama brought her some tea and a package. Some food, supplies, and that blue shawl you like, Margaret said, her voice fierce. You're my daughter, Lydia. Nothing changes that. They held each other tight, two women getting ready to survive just a little bit more. That night, Lydia saw her father for the last time as a single woman. Tomorrow, then, he whispered. Any regrets? She shook her head. I'm scared to death, but no. This feels like the right kind of wrong turn. He managed a small laugh. You're gonna be fine, Lydia girl. You're stronger than you know. She kissed his forehead, memorizing the feel of his papery skin. Tomorrow she'd be married. Tomorrow she'd leave everything behind. But for a few more hours, she was just Lydia Hale. Dawn came cold and gray. Lydia put on her best dress, a dark blue wool her mama had made 3 years back. The face in the mirror looked the same, but her gaze was different. This was a woman who'd made a choice. Her mama made breakfast, but nobody could eat. They just moved through the motions until it was finally time to go. Margaret wrapped the blue shawl around her daughter's shoulders. You write to us, she pleaded. And if he's not what he seems, you come straight home. Lydia promised she would, though they both knew home might not be there for long. The bank draft only bought them a little time. As she passed his door, her father called out, "Lydia, be brave, but don't be reckless. Be kind, but don't you be soft. And remember your own worth." "I hear you, Papa." "Good. Now go on, and don't look back." She walked out of that cabin and never once looked behind her. Ethan Crow was already waiting at the crossroads. He stood with two horses, a tough gelding for himself and a smaller mare with smart, calm eyes. He'd trimmed his beard and wore a clean shirt. "Miss Hale," he nodded. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I ran out of better options," she said plainly. He almost smiled. "I appreciate the honesty." From his saddlebag, he pulled a small book and a piece of paper. "I had a circuit preacher draw up the marriage certificate. He's waiting a quarter-mile up the trail. If you're still willin'." This was it, her last chance to turn back. She thought of her dying father, her mother's worried face, and the slow ruin of her family. Then she looked at Ethan's steady gray eyes. "I'm willing," she said. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes who asked no questions. The whole ceremony took less than 5 minutes. Words were said. "I do." Papers were signed. And just like that, she was Lydia Crow, a stranger to herself. Ethan paid the preacher, and then it was just the two of them, man and wife. "The mare is yours," Ethan said, gesturing to the smaller horse. "Her name is Slate. She's sure-footed." Lydia stroked the horse's soft nose, feeling a small bit of comfort. At least she'd have one friend where she was going. "How long will the ride be?" she asked. He looked at the sky. 2 days if we are lucky, 3 if we are not. "And where are we heading?" "North, into the high country." That is not a real answer, she thought. "It is the only one you are getting," his firm voice seemed to say. "I need you to trust me, Mrs. Crow." The name felt strange on her tongue. "I can try," she finally said. They pointed their horses north, toward mountains that cut into the gray sky like jagged teeth. The smoke from the settlement, her entire world until this morning, faded behind them. She never once looked back. The trail climbed through thick pine shadows. Ethan rode ahead, sure as a man who knew every stone and tree. Lydia followed, letting the rhythm of the horse quiet her racing mind. Around noon, they stopped to eat dry beef and biscuits from his saddlebag. The only sounds were the wind and a hawk crying somewhere high above. "You are a quiet man," Lydia said. "I just do not like wasting words," he answered. "If you have a real question, ask it. Otherwise, silence suits me just fine." "All right, then. What did you do before hiding out in these mountains?" For a second, something shifted in his eyes. "I worked, same as anybody." "Doing what?" "This and that. Nothing worth telling." "You are avoiding the question." "No, I am just a private man." Lydia held back a sharp reply. Arguing on the first day was a fool's errand. Instead, she watched him. He rode a horse like he was born on one, and his hands, though rough, were quick and sure. The way his eyes were always moving, scanning everything, told her he was more than just some simple man of the mountains. "Who are you, Ethan Crow?" she wondered. "And what have I done?" They made camp that night near a creek. Ethan put up a shelter with a practiced speed that was impressive. Lydia tended the horses, her hands moving gently as she checked their hooves, just as her father taught her. "You have a way with horses," Ethan noted as he built up a fire. "My father raised them," she said. "That is where I learned to ride, and how to work hard and make do with what you have. Useful skills for a mountain wife, I suppose." "Useful skills for anyone," he corrected. They ate the rabbit he had shot earlier so quietly she had not even heard the rifle, another skill that did not quite fit the poor man she had married in town. When the night turned cold, Lydia pulled her blue shawl tight. The fire was a small circle of warmth in the great big dark. "You should get some sleep," Ethan told her. "We have a hard climb tomorrow." "What about you?" "I will keep watch. It is an old habit." "A habit from what?" He looked at her across the flickering flames. From learning that the mountains do not care if you are tired. They will get you just the same, sleeping or awake. It was not a real answer, but she knew the conversation was over. She lay down in the shelter, wrapped in blankets that smelled of smoke and pine. Sleep was a long time coming. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the wedding, the ride, and this strange man she was now tied to. She woke to a cold dawn. Ethan was already up with coffee brewing over the fire. "Morning," he said, handing her a tin cup. "I slept enough," he answered before she could ask. They broke camp quickly, two strangers learning how to work together. Soon they were riding again, climbing higher. The trail grew narrow and dangerous, with steep drops just a step away. Her hands gripped the reins tightly. "Do not look down," Ethan called back. "Look where you want to go. Trust your horse." Lydia took a breath and loosened her grip. Her horse, Slate, immediately walked easier. Hours later, when she felt she could not climb another foot, the trail opened onto a high plateau. The view stole her breath. Snow-capped mountains stood all around them. A green valley, completely hidden from the world below, stretched out before them. In the distance, she could just make out the shapes of buildings. Ethan stopped his horse. "Welcome home, Mrs. Crow," he said softly. Lydia stared, a feeling of wonder and fear mixing in her stomach. The poor man she married had not brought her to a simple cabin. He had brought her to a secret place that was not on any map. Going down into the valley was somehow more frightening than the climb. The path was too well made, with stone markers and even a channel for water cut into the hillside. This was not the work of one man. It was planned. It was organized. Ethan watched her take it all in, but said nothing. The valley was wide and long, and the forest had been managed. Trees grew in neat rows, and the underbrush was cleared away. "How long have you lived here?" Lydia finally asked. "Off and on for 5 years. All the time for the last 3. His voice shut down any more questions. They followed a stream with banks lined with carefully placed stones. The running water was loud enough to cover the sound of anyone approaching. This place was not just hidden, she realized. It was a fortress. It was made to be defended. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "What is this place?" He pulled his horse to a halt and turned in his saddle, looking at her properly for the first time since they arrived. Ethan's gray eyes were serious. "It is a complicated life," he said, "but an honest one. Just hold your questions a little longer." He promised to answer what he could soon. It was not enough, but Lydia had no choice. As they rode on, buildings came into view. There was a huge, well-built barn, then another, a workshop, and a large storehouse. Finally, she saw the main house. It was not a fancy mansion, but a 2-storied timber lodge built to last for generations, with a wide porch and stone chimneys. It was far more than Ethan had described. As they got closer, she saw people working. They all stopped and stared, their faces showing surprise and then relief. A powerfully built man called out from the workshop, "Mr. Crow, we did not expect you back for another week." "Yeah, things had sure changed, Samuel." Ethan swung down off his horse and helped Lydia from hers. His hands were on her waist for just a second, but all the workers saw it. Their eyes flickered between Ethan and Lydia, full of questions. "This is my wife," Ethan said, plain and simple. "Lydia Crow. She'll be living here now. I expect y'all to make her feel welcome." The silence that followed was heavy. An older woman named Martha Hayes, the housekeeper, finally broke it with a slow smile. "Well now," she said, walking up with her hand out. "That's good news. Welcome, Mrs. Crow." Martha turned her sharp eyes on Ethan. "I see Mr. Crow has been his usual talkative self." She then took Lydia by the arm. "Come on, dear, let's get you inside." Lydia looked back once at Ethan, but his face gave nothing away. The main room of the lodge was bigger than she could have imagined, with a giant stone fireplace and shelves filled with hundreds of books. "I'll show you to your room," Martha said, leading her up a heavy timber staircase. "Mr. Crow has the south suite. I've put you in the north one." The room Martha opened was enormous, with a 4-poster bed and its own private washroom. "There is running water," Martha showed her, "and that door there connects to the master suite. But it locks from your side, so your privacy is your own. Lydia went to the window and looked down at the whole operation. Barns, workshops, and gardens spread out below, with mountains ringing the valley on all sides. "How many folks live here?" she asked. "Depends on the season," Martha replied. "We're mostly self-sufficient up here. It's a good life." Lydia finally had to ask, "What exactly is this place?" Martha's smile was kind. "That's a question for Mr. Crow, but I will say this. He's a good man, complicated for sure, but a good man." Just then, a knock came at the door. It was Ethan. Martha slipped out, leaving them alone. He'd washed up and changed his shirt. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "That's putting it mildly," Lydia shot back. "Then ask." "What is this place?" she demanded. "A timber operation," he answered. "My family has holdings all through these mountains. This valley is the center of it all." "Your family? You told me you were a poor mountain man." "I never said that," Ethan replied calmly. "You assumed it. I wanted to know if you would marry me for myself, not for what I own." Anger flared in her chest. "So it was a test? You let me believe I was trading myself for nothing?" "No," he said sharply. "I never lied to you, Lydia. I just did not tell you the whole truth. Would you have believed me if I had? If I had ridden up and told you I was some wealthy man?" Lydia had to admit he was right. She would have thought he was crazy or trying to trick her. "So you deceived me instead," she said. "I gave you a choice you could prove," he answered. "The rest is just extra." "And what do you get out of this?" she asked. Ethan looked out the window. "My father built this place. When he died 3 years ago, he left it all to me, along with a heap of trouble. Partners who don't respect me, investors who think I'm too soft." "What does that have to do with needing a wife?" "Appearances matter," he said, finally looking at her. "A married man seems more stable. I needed a partner, not an actress. Someone from the mountains who would not be scared off by money or business." "Someone who stood up to a debt collector," Ethan corrected. "Someone smart enough to handle complicated situations. You barely know me. I watched you for 3 weeks. I know enough." "So you watched me for weeks before you made the offer?" The confession just hung there in the air. Lydia stared at him, saying, "You did what?" "I had to be certain," he said. "I went to your settlement and just watched. I saw how you took care of your father and handled your mother. I saw how you dealt with the pity and the contempt from neighbors. You were already running an impossible situation with nothing but grit. That is exactly what I needed." Lydia felt torn between flattered and furious. "You spied on me." "I did my research," he countered. She took a step back. "What else are you hiding from me?" He gave a hint of a smile. "I will not lie to you. If you ask a straight question, you will get a straight answer. Can you live with that?" She thought for a moment. "All right. But I want that in writing. An agreement. If this is business, let's make it official." Now Ethan gave a real smile. "You are sharp. What are your terms?" "First, honesty when I ask. Second, my own money, no questions asked." "No." "Third, freedom to see my family. And fourth," she said, her voice firm, "this marriage is a partnership. You do not own me." "Agreed," he said without a single hesitation. "Anything else?" "Not yet," she replied. "I am sure I will think of more." He nodded. "For what it is worth, Lydia, I am glad you came. We had better work well together," she said softly. "I just gave up everything I knew for this." After he was gone, Lydia sat on the bed, feeling the weight of it all. The room was nice, smelling of pine and clean wood. She had married a complete stranger to save her folks, but he was far more powerful and complicated than she ever imagined. A soft knock came at the door. Martha, the housekeeper, entered with a tray. "Thought you might want some tea." She poured 2 cups, adding plenty of milk and sugar to Lydia's. "Mr. Crow is a good man," Martha began, "but he has been alone for a long, long time. His mother passed when he was just a boy, and his father was a hard man. Ethan learned early on to trust no one and to assume everyone wants something from him. "It is a lonely way to live," Lydia said. "Yes, ma'am, it is. But it has kept him safe. There are always folks trying to take advantage of him. Family, business partners, you name it. When he said he was going to find a wife, I was worried he would come back with a fortune hunter. I'm glad to see I was wrong about that." "You do not know that yet," Lydia said. "Oh, I think I do. You asked for terms instead of promises. You are sitting here figuring out your next move instead of crying. That tells me you are practical, and practical is what this place needs." "Why are you telling me all this?" Lydia asked. "Because I have watched that man carry burdens that would break most anyone. I would like to see him have an ally for once. You can be that for him if you choose. Or you can just be a wife on paper. The choice is yours. And if I choose to leave, then you leave. Mr. Crow would see to it that you and your family were taken care of. But I hope you will stay." After Martha left, Lydia found a small library of books in her room. Someone, either Ethan or Martha, had thought about what she might actually need. It was a kindness she... That evening, a knock brought a young woman named Anne carrying a pitcher of steaming water for a bath. Anne, who helped Martha around the house, insisted on calling her Mrs. Crow. The formality was a surprise. Lydia realized with a sudden weight that marriage to Ethan gave her authority here, a responsibility she had not asked for. Later, she went downstairs to meet the rest of the household. Ethan was at his desk and several of his men were in the main room. He introduced them properly. Samuel was the foreman, while two brothers, James and Robert, ran the logging crews. Everyone treated her with a polite deference that felt strange. It was clear she was no longer just Lydia, but the wife of the man in charge. Dinner conversation was all business. Talk of timber contracts and preparing for winter. Curious, Lydia asked how much timber they processed. The table fell silent until Ethan gave a nod. He told her they managed about 500,000 board feet in a good year. Samuel explained that the core crew of about 20 men lived there year-round, with more hired on during the harvest season. When Lydia asked what happened in winter, Ethan's face grew guarded. He mentioned maintenance, planning, and then paused. "This year," he said slowly, "we have some other challenges." The men shifted in their seats, suddenly uneasy. When Lydia pressed him, Ethan gently dismissed her question, saying it was nothing for her to worry about. The tone was protective, but it felt like being shut out. She decided to let it go for now, but filed the mystery away. That night, Lydia lay awake in the huge, unfamiliar room, listening to the wind howl through the valley. She thought of her family, hoping the money had reached them and eased their burdens. She also thought about her stranger of a husband, a wealthy timber baron who had posed as a poor man. The next few days fell into a routine. Lydia helped Martha in the kitchen and explored the compound. It was a self-sufficient world with barns, a workshop, and livestock. The place was a small, functioning town hidden in the mountains. The workers were polite but kept their distance, and Ethan was often gone, checking on his operations or shut away in his office. He remained courteous but distant, as if keeping a wall between them. On the fourth day, a rider arrived from the past, the first outsider she had seen. He carried a sealed message from Denver for Mr. Crow. Lydia watched from the porch as Ethan read it, his jaw tightening. "Tell them I'll be there in a week," Ethan told the rider, "and that my answer has not changed." After the man left, Ethan stood in the yard with a dark expression. Lydia asked if it was bad news. He looked up, finally seeming to notice her. "Complicated news," he said. "My uncle wants a meeting about those challenges I mentioned." He paused, then turned back to her. "Actually, this concerns you, too. You ought to know what you have walked into." He motioned for her to follow him into his office, a room she had never seen before, was not expecting. That evening, Ethan led her into a large office. "My father had two brothers," Ethan said, shutting the door. "One is named Marcus, and he believes half of this business is his. When my father left it all to me, Marcus fought the will and lost. He has been making trouble ever since, spreading rumors and trying to undermine my contracts. Now he is demanding a big meeting in Denver, claiming I am mismanaging everything. Are you? No, we are doing just fine. But Marcus is good at making trouble. The meeting is in 10 days. We will need to leave in 3. I need you there with me, he said, his voice level. A married man looks more stable, and if he is going to question my judgment, I want to show him I can build a partnership. So you want me to play the part of the happy wife? I want you to be yourself, sharp and unintimidated. That will be far more convincing. And if I say no, then I go alone and face him myself. It is your choice, Lydia. But I am asking for your help as your husband and your partner. It was the first time he had called her his partner, and the words settled between them full of meaning. She thought about the life she was trying to build with this complicated man, and decided right then she wouldn't be just an obligation. All right, she finally said. I will go, but we are doing this my way. You tell me everything I need to know about your uncle and this business. No more surprises. A look of relief, and maybe a little respect, crossed Ethan's face. Deal. He promised to teach her the entire timber business, from the stakeholders down to his uncle's particular brand of poison. The next morning, his office looked like a war room. Maps and ledgers covered a large table showing an empire she never imagined. This is it, Ethan said, pointing to a huge map. My father spent 30 years building this from a single borrowed wagon into the biggest timber operation from Denver to San Francisco. Lydia stared at the map, trying to grasp the sheer size of it all. The business directly employed about 200 people, and another 300 folks depended on their contracts to make a living. Ethan explained they had 5 major operations, each run by a foreman. And your uncle wants all of this? She asked. Not all of it. Just a share, Ethan clarified. He thinks being family entitles him to it, even though my father wrote him out of the will. My uncle Marcus has a gambling problem. My daddy bailed him out twice, but the second time he told him there would not be a third. This meeting is his idea of revenge. If he can make me look like I do not know what I am doing, he will try to force his way in. Once he gets his hands on the money, he will bleed this company dry in 2 years. Ethan pointed to a list of 3 main investors. Harrison Wells runs a railroad and values stability above all else. If he leaves, we lose 40% of our money. Then there is Margaret Chen. She is a shrewd businesswoman who runs mining operations. If she sides with me, my uncle loses all his credibility. The third is Richard Blackwood. He represents new money from the East, folks who are quick to back out if things look shaky. Lydia took it all in. So Wells wants stability, Chen wants a sharp operator, and Blackwood wants a sure thing. Your uncle will try to paint you as the opposite of all 3. Ethan looked at her, surprised. That is exactly right. He admitted that his new way of doing things, like paying better wages and logging sustainably, was not popular with the old guard. I am putting our future before quick money, he said. It takes longer, but it means we will still be here in 20 years. Lydia saw him differently then. He wasn't just some rich man. He truly believed in building something better, even if it was the harder path. Your uncle will call that weakness, she warned. I know, Ethan admitted. That is why I need to prove my way works. He pointed to ledgers. But Marcus can twist numbers 6 ways to Sunday. Lydia sat down, pulling a ledger toward her. Then do not defend your choices. Present them as the only right way to do things. Show me what we are up against. For hours they pored over the books until Lydia understood the business inside and out. You learn quick, Ethan said, impressed. Lydia rubbed her eyes. One last thing. Why did you really need a wife for this? He paused. Marcus claims no decent woman would have me, that I am too strange. Bringing you proves him wrong. It shows I am building a future, not just sitting on a pile of money. The 4-day trip to Denver was rough. They left the valley before dawn, eventually boarding a crowded and uncomfortable stagecoach. Lydia stayed quiet, but she watched and listened to everything. The way Ethan kept to himself, the way strangers sized them up, and the gossip that revealed the state of business and politics. You are being mighty quiet, Ethan noted when they stopped. I am listening, she replied. Folks say a lot when they think no one important is paying attention. He gave a small smile. I am beginning to think I underestimated you. Most people do, Lydia said. I have learned to use that. Denver was a shock after the quiet mountains. It was a bustling city with buildings that stretched 4 stories high and paved streets. At the Grand Windsor Hotel, the clerk's attitude changed the second he saw Ethan's name. "Mr. Crow, we have your suite ready." He eyed Lydia. "Should I prepare another room?" "The suite is fine," Ethan said smoothly. "My wife and I prefer adjoining rooms." Inside their rooms, Ethan pointed out the locks. "You will have your privacy. I meant what I said. This is a partnership. That does not change just because we are in the city." Lydia found herself believing him. The next day, Ethan insisted on buying her proper city clothes. "Is this necessary?" she asked the dressmaker. "It is armor," Ethan told her. "Marcus will try to make you feel small. Do not give him the chance." At the hotel, Ethan met with his attorney, a man named Lawrence Porter. For 3 solid hours, they mapped out their strategy. In a corner, Lydia pretended to read but listened to every word. She found it odd that Ethan never explained her presence, and the lawyer never asked. Porter said, "The key is not letting Marcus control the story. State your facts and don't get defensive." Lydia looked up from her book. "What about when he makes it personal?" Both men turned to her. "His uncle has been attacking Ethan's character, not his business plans. Those are personal shots." Porter glanced at Ethan, who simply nodded. "She's right. Marcus will get ugly." "Then don't play his game," Lydia said plainly. "Acknowledge him, then pivot right back to the business. It will make him look petty." Porter broke into a slow grin. "Mrs. Crow, has anyone ever told you that you should have been a lawyer?" "No," she said. "But I have dealt with enough debt collectors to know a bully when I see one." Later, after the lawyer left, Ethan poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Lydia. "To tomorrow," he said, raising his glass. She took a small sip, feeling the welcome warmth spread through her chest. "Are you worried?" she asked him. "Less than I was before you got here," he admitted. He settled into a chair and looked at her seriously. "Can I ask you something? Do you regret marrying me?" Lydia thought for a moment. She considered the life of poverty she left behind, and the powerful, complicated man sitting in front of her. Her future and his would be decided in the morning. "Ask me again in a week," she finally said. He let out a genuine laugh. "Fair enough." They sat in a comfortable silence. 2 strangers just weeks ago, now partners preparing for a fight. The next morning, the territorial business office felt cold and imposing. Lydia kept her head high as they walked in, her hand resting on Ethan's arm. Inside a large conference room, the air was thick with tension. Marcus Crow stood near the head of the table, holding court. When his eyes landed on Ethan, they were filled with contempt. "Nephew," Marcus boomed. "So good of you to finally join us. I was worried you'd forgotten." "We are 10 minutes early, Marcus," Ethan replied, his voice steady. Marcus's gaze slid over to Lydia. "And who is this charming creature you have brought along?" "My wife, Lydia Crow," Ethan said. "Lydia, this is my uncle Marcus." Lydia offered her hand. "Mr. Crow, it is so lovely to meet Ethan's family." Marcus held her hand a moment too long. "A wife? Well, now, this is news. Seems rather sudden, does it not?" "We like to keep our personal lives private," Ethan stated firmly. "Tell me, my dear," Marcus said, ignoring Ethan. "How long have you known my nephew?" "Long enough to know his character, Mr. Crow," Lydia replied smoothly. "And I believe that is what truly matters, do you not think?" A flicker of surprise crossed Marcus's face. Before he could respond, a silver-haired official called the meeting to order. Everyone took their seats. Ethan and Lydia sat on one side, with Marcus and his allies on the other. At the end of the table, 3 main investors sat like judges. Harrison Wells, Margaret Chen, and Richard Blackwood watched with unreadable expressions. "Mr. Marcus Crow," the official began, "you called this meeting. Please state your case." Marcus stood up. "Thank you, Commissioner. My brother built this company from nothing. When he died 3 years ago, he left it to his son, But I have watched with growing concern as inexperience and poor judgment have threatened everything my brother built. Those are serious accusations, the commissioner said. Can you be specific? Certainly, Marcus said with a smug air. First, his new logging practices have cut our profits. Second, his idealistic approach to workers has alienated our partners. And finally, he has shown himself to be completely incapable of leading this company. And what do you propose? The official asked. Simple. I propose that I be appointed managing partner. Ethan can keep his ownership, but the decision-making must be handled by someone with more experience. The room fell silent. The commissioner then turned to Ethan. Mr. Crow, your response? I would like to respond, Ethan said, standing tall. My uncle is correct that I have made changes. What he calls reduced efficiency, I call sustainability. We are harvesting our timber so the forest will still be here in 10 years, long after other operations have cleared their land and moved on. Can you prove that? Asked Richard Blackwood. I can, Ethan said, opening a ledger. Our profits are up 4% because our costs are down 7%. We are taking care of our equipment and our people. This business will now last 40 years instead of 15. Margaret Chen seemed interested. Do you have the contracts to back that up? I do, Ethan said, including yours, Mrs. Chen. Marcus jumped in, trying to stir up trouble with another partner. Harrison, tell them about your disagreement. But Wells surprised him. Actually, your nephew was right. His proposal was fair for both of us in the long run. Marcus's jaw tightened. He turned his attack personal. He has also shown poor judgment in his sudden marriage to a woman we know nothing about. Every eye in the room landed on Lydia. Before Ethan could speak, she placed a hand on his arm and stood up to face his uncle. Mr. Crow, you are right, she said, her voice clear and steady. You do not know me. Allow me to change that. Your background is not the issue here, Mr. Crow, Lydia said, her voice cutting through the tension. Your motives are. This meeting is about the resentment you feel because your nephew built something you never could. The room fell silent. Mr. Crow, what is your business experience? Margaret Chen asked calmly. My uncle has been involved in many ventures, all of which failed, Ethan answered quietly. My father bailed you out twice. He cut you from the will because he knew you would destroy everything he built. That is slander, Marcus yelled. It is documented, Ethan replied, holding up a folder. My lawyer has the records of both bailouts. We can review them right now if you would like. Marcus Crow's confidence shattered. He looked around for support but found none. Ethan then turned to the investors, calmly laying out how he had provided 3 years of stable, consistent business and sound business practices. What more do you need to see? Wells thought for a moment. Not a thing. I am perfectly happy with how things are. Mrs. Chen, a sharp woman of business, gave a small smile. I am happy as well. In fact, I'm impressed with your business sense and your choice of a wife, Mr. Blackwood. The younger man had been watching Lydia more than Ethan. I came here expecting to hear about a mess. Instead, I heard about new ideas, taking care of the land, and thinking about the future. That is exactly what we want to see. He stood up and shook Ethan's hand. Count me in on any plans for expansion. Marcus looked around, knowing he had lost. This is just plain ridiculous. Y'all are being fooled by pretty words. In 5 years, Ethan's voice turned hard as stone, we will still be here, making a profit and doing things the right way. You, Uncle Marcus, will have to find another way to pay for your gambling. The word struck Marcus hard. His face turned pale. You have no right. I have every right. This is my company and my future. Ethan looked at the commissioner. Is there anything else? The official shook his head. I think we have heard enough. Mr. Crow, your concerns were heard and answered. I see no reason to step in. Marcus froze, then stormed out of the room. 2 of his friends followed him, looking ashamed. After they were gone, the investors gathered around to congratulate Ethan. Margaret Chen pulled Lydia aside. "That was handled mighty fine," she said softly. "Marcus figured you would be scared or out of your depth. Instead, you made him look like a fool." "I only told the truth," Lydia said. "Truth told at just the right time is a skill, Mrs. Crow. Do not ever forget that." Mrs. Chen gave her a business card. "I would like to talk with you and your husband soon. Not today. Y'all have earned a celebration." When they were finally alone, Ethan turned to Lydia. "You did not have to do that for me," he said. "Yes, I did. We are partners, remember? That means we fight our battles together." He looked at her for a long time. "I was wrong about you," he finally said. "I thought I needed someone capable. What I found was someone truly special." Lydia felt her cheeks grow warm. "I just said what needed to be said." "That is what special people do," he replied, offering his arm. They left the building and stepped into the bright Denver afternoon. Lydia felt a great weight lift from her shoulders. They had won. They had stood against a man who should have been family and proved him wrong. As Ethan led her to a restaurant, she realized things had changed. They were not just strangers in a business deal anymore. They were becoming real partners, building something on respect. The marriage may have started as a contract, but it was turning into something real. The victory dinner was going just fine until a messenger showed up with an envelope. It was an invitation from Ethan's Aunt Caroline, the wife of the man they had just beaten. He looked at Lydia and said, "It's a trap." His aunt wanted to welcome the new Mrs. Crow to the family, but really she wanted to find a weakness. Turning her down would only prove her right. Lydia looked him straight in the eye and said, "Then we'll go." She figured if she could learn the timber business in a week, she could handle one fancy dinner. The next day, Ethan bought her a beautiful green silk gown, one that cost more than her daddy made in a whole year. He warned her that Caroline would try her best to make Lydia feel small and out of place. That evening, Lydia looked at herself in the mirror. Dressed in that expensive gown and borrowed jewels, she barely recognized the woman staring back. But underneath it all, she was still the same person who had fought to save her family. She touched the simple cameo necklace from her own mother, whispering, "Don't you forget who you are." The Crow Mansion in Denver was nothing like their home in the valley. It was enormous, and the small family dinner was a party with at least 40 of the city's richest folks. Ethan took her arm. "Stay close," he said. "You don't have to face this alone." Aunt Caroline appeared right away with a smile that was all sugar and no warmth. She looked Lydia up and down. "What an interesting dress," she said. "It has a certain rustic charm." Lydia smiled right back. "Thank you. I've always preferred good taste over fashion." Carolyn's smile tightened as she started asking about Lydia's family. To make things easier, Lydia told a small white lie about her father. Just then, a judge's wife named Helena came over. She was blunt. "So, how did you manage to catch a bachelor like Ethan?" Lydia answered plainly. "He asked, and I accepted." But Helena pushed, wanting to hear about a whirlwind romance. The whole room seemed to be listening. Lydia spoke clearly. "It was practical. We were honest about what we each needed, and I think honesty is a lot more romantic than pretty lies." The silence was deafening. Then Helena let out a genuine laugh. "Well, I'll be," she said, "an honest woman in Denver." At the long dinner table, Lydia was seated far from Ethan. The first course was oysters, which she had never seen before. A kind woman next to her, Mrs. Newcomb, noticed her hesitation. "Don't you worry," she whispered. "These parties are meant to make outsiders feel foolish. The secret is most of these folks are just better at hiding their own fears." And talked about people she had never met. She mostly listened, learning the way they spoke and the rules they never said out loud. Then Mr. Whitmore turned to her. "Mrs. Crow, I hear you are from the mountains. What do you think of Denver? It must be a shock after living so simply." The question was a trap, meant to make her look like a country bumpkin. Lydia knew the game. "Denver is a fine city," she said, "but I would not call mountain life simple. The skills it takes to live out there, managing what you have, predicting the weather, Handling emergencies, building things, raising animals, that is not simple knowledge. Most city folks would be lost without it. Are you saying city life makes people weak? Mr. Whitmore asked, sounding offended. I am saying different places require different strengths. You are good at navigating banks. I am good at surviving when there are no banks to navigate. Neither one is better, just different. A few people at the table nodded in agreement, but Caroline was not done. My dear, she said from the head of the table, I am curious. How much schooling did you get before marrying my nephew? I imagine it was not much. The table went quiet. This was the real attack. Lydia put down her fork and looked right at Caroline. I had 6 years of school before it closed down. After that, my father taught me from his. I was educated by my mother in our books, Mrs. Crowe. She taught me numbers, contracts, and how to negotiate. I may not have a fancy degree, but I can read and think, which is more than some folks with diplomas can manage. Caroline pushed, saying the business side of things must surely be too much for me. I looked her in the eye and said, I learned the entire timber business in 1 week. If I could figure it out that fast, how complicated can it be? Someone across the table choked back a laugh. Caroline's face turned bright pink. Understanding and managing are 2 different things, she snapped. I agreed. Ethan manages the operation. I support him. It is called a partnership, which is how most good marriages work. A woman next to Caroline spoke up, saying it sounded like good old-fashioned sense. Mrs. Newcomb leaned in close. You just made an enemy of her. I whispered back. She already was. Now she just knows I am not an easy one. After dinner, the men went one way to talk business, and the women went the other. The women gathered around me, full of questions. One asked if it was true I had married Ethan after knowing him less than a day. I told her, we were honest about what we each needed. That is a better foundation than some long courtship built on fantasy. Another asked how I could love a man I barely knew. I said, I never said I did. We are building respect in a partnership. Love, if it comes, will have to grow from that. An older, sharp-eyed woman studied me. You are remarkably honest, Mrs. Crowe. She reached out her hand. I am Margaret Chen. I came here tonight just to meet you. You have grit and good instincts. You do not apologize for who you are. She glanced around the room. Most of these women mistake their soft living for strength. You have the real thing. I thanked her, feeling like her words were a lifeline. I suspect I know exactly how much it means. Margaret lowered her voice. I want to discuss a business proposition with you and Ethan. Come to my office tomorrow. Before I could answer, Caroline was at my elbow. Mrs. Chen, are you enjoying yourself? Margaret smiled. Very much. Your new niece is a delight. Caroline's own smile was pure ice. I am just surprised Ethan did not choose someone with a more appropriate background. Margaret's eyes went cold. Appropriate for what, Caroline? Ethan needs a partner, not a pretty ornament for his arm. Mrs. Crowe seems perfectly suited for the job. She then reminded Caroline that most successful people in the territory, including them, came from trade. My dear, she said, turning back to me, I will see you at 10 o'clock. She swept off, leaving Caroline fuming in front of her guests. The party could not end soon enough for me. In the carriage on the way back, Ethan asked, how bad was it? I sighed. Caroline tried to make me feel small. I refused to let her. I would rather deal with 10 angry creditors than another one of her dinner parties. He chuckled softly. You handled yourself well. And having Margaret Chen take an interest in you is no small thing. She does not waste her time on people she does not respect. He was quiet for a moment. Lydia, I know this is not what you signed up for. I told him, we are in this together, remember? That means facing whatever comes. He reached across the carriage and took my hand. His grip was warm and steady. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing with me." We rode the rest of the way to the hotel, holding hands in the dark, a new layer of our partnership settling into place. Margaret Chen's office was plain and practical, with a large desk and maps on the walls. She was a woman who cared about work, not appearances. "I don't waste money on fancy things," she said plainly, seeing Lydia's surprise. "I put it where it'll grow." She poured them tea and got right to the point. "I was mighty impressed with you two at that meeting. You all work together like a real team, which is rare. Ethan, I appreciate your thanks, but let's get down to brass tacks. My mining operations have the same problem as your timber business. My foremen want to gut the land for a quick profit. I want to build something that lasts. That's a leadership problem, I know. I need advisors who get that. Folks who know how to make a dollar while keeping an eye on tomorrow. That's why I want to hire you both as consultants." Lydia looked at Ethan, who seemed interested but wary. "Why both of us?" he asked. "You've got the business sense, Mr. Crow," Margaret cut in. "But your wife, she's got something just as important. She understands how to survive when things get lean. That's the kind of thinking my mines need. Careful and smart, not just fast and greedy." Lydia admitted, "I don't know a thing about mining." "You'll learn," Margaret said with a smile. "You learned the timber trade in a week. Ms. Crow, I don't make offers like this for just anyone. I see a sharp mind and a strong backbone in you. That's worth a heck of a lot." Lydia felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling of being truly seen. "We would need to discuss the particulars," Ethan said carefully. "Of course. Y'all think it over and send me a proposal," Margaret said, standing up to shake their hands. As they left, Lydia's world was spinning. A few weeks ago, she was facing ruin. Now she was a timber baron's wife with a job offer that valued her own mind. "Well, what do you reckon?" Ethan asked on the walk back. "I'm scared to death and thrilled to pieces," she confessed. "And I don't know if I can do what she's asking." "You can," Ethan said firmly. "I watched you learn my whole business, then stand up to a room full of sharks. I saw you handle Caroline without even breaking a sweat. Yes, Lydia, I believe you can do this. The only question is if you believe it." She thought of the desperate girl she used to be, then of the woman she was becoming. "I want to try," she said at last. Ethan gave her a real, warm smile. "Good. Because I want to take her offer as true partners." "Partners?" Lydia echoed. "Equals." They came back to the valley 3 days later with new deals and a new direction. The mountain air felt clean and welcoming after the city. Martha's hot coffee and a warm meal felt like coming home. Later that evening, Ethan found Lydia on the porch watching the sunset. "Thinking about how much has changed in just a month," she said. "You don't have to go back to who you were," he told her. "Thank you for seeing something in me I didn't see myself." He paused. "Lydia, I know this began as a business deal, but I hope it can become something more. No rush, just more. If you're willing." Her heart skipped a beat. It was not love yet, but it was a solid foundation you could build on. "I'm willing," she said softly. "Let's see what we can build together." Winter hit the valley with a vengeance, burying everything under 2 feet of snow 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Lydia woke up to a world of white silence, sealed off from everything until spring. The valley had truly become her home. She knew the work and the workers. The rhythm of the place was now her own. A knock came on the door connecting her room to Ethan's. That door had been opening more often lately as they grew closer. "Come in," she called. Ethan walked in holding a telegram, his face serious. "It's from your mother," he said, handing it to her. Lydia's hands shook as she opened the thin paper. The message was short, written in the operator's clipped style. "Father passed peacefully." The telegram was blunt. "Debts cleared, thank you. Letter following. Mother." Lydia read the short message again. A strange peace settled over her grief. The man who taught her everything was gone. But he died a free man. Ethan spoke softly. I am sorry, Lydia. She nodded, placing the paper by her mother's cameo. I knew it was coming, but it is still hard. Ethan offered to take her home through the closed mountain passes. She surprised herself with a firm no. Her father was gone, and her mother was provided for. Lydia knew her duty was now here, in this valley that had become her real home. She knew her father, a practical man, would have understood. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Her mother's shaky handwriting confirmed her father had passed peacefully. He was proud of Lydia's strength and the new life she was building. The money she sent had saved their home. Her mother urged her not to grieve too much, but to build her new life, just as her father would have wanted. Lydia finally allowed herself to cry, mourning the man she had lost and the girl she used to be. Then she dried her tears and returned to her work. Winter isolated the 23 souls in the compound, turning them into a small, self-reliant town. Lydia found she had a knack for keeping the peace. She organized shared meals, started a book-lending library, and managed work schedules to keep spirits up. She was a natural leader. Martha, one of the workers, told her one evening, "You have a gift for managing people. It is just common sense to you, but that is a rare thing." Ethan saw it too. He began treating her as a true partner in the business, not just in name. They discussed equipment, hiring, and plans for the next season. Their evening meetings became a comfortable routine, blurring the line between business and something more personal. A simple touch of his hand on her back felt like more than just partnership. One night by the fire, after the ledgers were put away, she asked him about his mother. "She died when I was 12, Ethan said, looking into the flames. "She was a kind woman who read me poetry. After she was gone, my father focused only on business, and I became another asset for him to manage." He explained that he learned everything about the timber business, but nothing about being a person. "Is that why you came here?" Lydia asked. "Partly," he admitted. "I inherited an empire I never wanted. This valley was my refuge, a place to build something for myself. But then I realized I was just hiding." He turned to her. "That is when I went looking for you." Their conversation shifted, uncovering a deep respect that was quickly turning into affection. This quiet trust was growing into something that felt like love. "Ethan," Lydia began softly, "this arrangement is not what either of us planned, is it?" "No," he said, taking her hand. "It is better. I thought I was getting a business partner. Instead, I found a friend who makes me want to be a better man." "I thought I was just surviving," she confessed. "But I found a purpose, and a man worth building a life with." He stood and pulled her to her feet. For the first time, he kissed her with genuine tenderness, a kiss full of promise. "That was long overdue," Ethan said with a smile. "I wanted to wait until you were sure you were choosing this, choosing me, without any obligation." "I choose you," Lydia said, her voice clear and strong. "I want this." They held each other by the fire, two strangers who had become everything to one another. The winter winds howled outside, but inside Lydia had never felt more safe or certain. Spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new challenges and opportunities. Margaret Chen came to the valley as promised, ready to begin her work. She was impressed with their operation. As Lydia walked the land with Margaret and Ethan, discussing the business, she realized she was no longer just a partner in name. She was a creator, building a future in the place she now called home, a way of managing things that came from her different life. "Here is what I do not get," she said, looking at a logged area. "Y'all are focused on getting the most out of this land right now. But what about the value of the land itself? If you ruin the forest to get the timber, you have lost all its future value." "That is the argument for sustainability," Ethan said. "But our partners want their money now, not in 20 years. "Then show them what it costs to not think ahead," Lydia replied. "Show them the value of steady production instead of a boom and bust. This part of the forest will be ready to harvest again in 15 years. A clear-cut area will not be useful for 50 years or more. That is the real cost. Lost opportunity." Margaret was writing it all down. My own people talk about being good to the land, but you are talking about pure economics. That is something investors understand. It is economics, Lydia agreed. Good morals might convince some folks, but money convinces everyone. If you prove that doing things the right way is more profitable in the long run, the argument is over. You ought to write this down, Margaret said. A real proposal I can show my board. Lydia looked at Ethan, who nodded for her to go on. All right, I will write it. The proposal took her 3 weeks of hard work. She worked late into the night, making her arguments solid and clear. Ethan helped her, but the work was all hers. When she finally gave the document to Margaret, the older woman read it with great care. This is first rate, Margaret finally said. You've got a real gift. I want to offer you a permanent job as a consultant for my mining operations, separate from your husband. Lydia could hardly breathe. You mean it? I do. You think differently, and I need that. Ethan smiled. You should take it. You earned this. Turning back to Margaret, Lydia said, Then yes, I accept. They shook on it, and Lydia was no longer just a wife, but a businesswoman. Later that summer, a letter arrived from Caroline Crowe. As Ethan read it, his face went from dark to grimly satisfied. What is it? Lydia asked. Marcus is under investigation for fraud. He was selling worthless mining claims. Now Caroline wants us to make a public statement saying we have no connection to him, to save the family's reputation. What will you do? She asked. Exactly what she wants, Ethan said with a sharp smile. Marcus has nothing to do with us, and I want that on the record. But we will just state the facts, no family drama. That will drive her crazy. They wrote a short professional statement. Soon, news of Marcus's arrest was everywhere, and Caroline's social standing crumbled. Lydia felt a sense of justice, but no joy in her fall. That summer, the valley prospered. Lydia's consulting work took off, and her mother, Margaret Hale, came for a visit. Seeing the valley for the first time, her mother was breathless. Lydia, you never told me it was like this. I wasn't sure you would believe me, Lydia replied. You just have to see it for yourself, Lydia told her mother. For the next 2 weeks, Margaret took it all in. She saw the size of the place, the quality of everything, and the genuine respect people had for her daughter. Long evenings on the porch were spent catching up, filling in all the spaces that letters just could not. Your daddy would be so proud, Margaret said one evening, watching the sun go down. Not because of the money. He would have seen right through that. But because you took a hopeless situation and made something good out of it. I had good teachers, Lydia replied softly. That may be, but you found the grit to use what you learned, Margaret said. So tell me true, Lydia. Are you happy? Lydia thought about the desperate, worried life she had left behind, and then looked at the life she had now. I am happy, she said. Not because it is easy, but because we are building something that matters. I love who he is, and I love who we are together. That is the kind of love that lasts. Margaret smiled, content. That is what I had with your father, a partnership that grew into love. There is no better foundation. During one planning session, Lydia suggested a new idea. We could start a training program, she said. We can teach other folks our methods and make a new stream of income that is not tied to timber. Ethan immediately started sketching out the plans. They had the know-how and the numbers to prove their system worked. It was more than just good business. It was a chance to show the whole industry that you could be successful without exploiting people or the land. By that autumn, they had opened the Crowe Institute. The first class had 6 foremen, and Lydia discovered she was a natural teacher. She made complicated ideas seem simple. A grizzled old foreman named Tom Walsh told her, I have been in this business 30 years, and I never thought about it the way you just explained. It just makes plain good sense. After that, word spread like wildfire, and the Institute became the place to learn. While their influence grew, Marcus's trial ended. He got a 5-year prison sentence and was left financially ruined. His wife, Caroline, left Denver for San Francisco with her social standing completely destroyed. The family that had tried to tear them down had only succeeded in destroying itself. Ethan got one final bitter letter from Caroline. "She still does not understand," Lydia said, reading over his shoulder. "This was never about winning." Ethan nodded. "Some people only think in terms of conquering things. They cannot understand partnership." He tossed the letter into the fireplace, watching the past burn away to make room for their future. When winter came again, Lydia was not a stranger trying to fit in. She was home, with work she loved, and a marriage that was real. One snowy December evening, Ethan found her looking out the window. The door connecting their rooms now stayed permanently open. "Come to bed," he said gently. She turned to face him, the man who had been a complete stranger just 18 months ago. "Do you remember what you said when you first proposed to me?" she asked him. "That this was a business deal with no false expectations." "I remember," he said. "Well, you were right and wrong," she continued. "You were right that honesty and partnership are vital. But you were wrong to think that love could not grow from it. Our love is stronger because it was built on that solid ground." He pulled her into his arms, and they looked out at the snow together. "This is better than anything I could have planned," Ethan said quietly. In the silence, Lydia thought of her mother. "I want to ask my mother to come live here with us," she said. "She is lonely in that little cabin." Ethan did not hesitate for a second. "This is your home as much as it is mine, Lydia. If you want your mother here, then that is where she will be." She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." "Thank you," she told Ethan one night, "for seeing me when no one else did, and for building this life with me." "You saved me, Lydia," he said, "from a loneliness I never even knew I had." Spring came, and Lydia's mother moved to the valley for good. The Crow Institute they founded became a huge success, training managers from all over, and publishing a textbook on sustainable business. Lydia's name was right there on the cover next to Ethan's. Margaret Chen's mining business boomed using their principles. And Lydia herself was transformed. The scared girl was gone, replaced by a confident woman who never forgot where she came from. She started a fund to help families facing the kind of debt that almost broke her own. 5 years after their wedding, Lydia stood on the porch with Ethan, 7 months pregnant with their first child. "Content?" Ethan asked. "Very," she smiled. "I have no regrets." She thought back on the journey, the struggles with Marcus and Caroline, and the slow, hard-won changes. "Not a single one. I would not change a thing, because it all led me right here. Especially the hard parts," she added. "They showed me who I could be." She took his hand and placed it on her belly where their daughter kicked. "This life, our daughter, our home, none of it would be here without every one of those difficult moments." "You are remarkable," he said. "I am just stubborn," she replied. "You are both," he said, "and I am grateful for it every day." She had married a man she thought was a poor mountaineer, but he turned out to be rich. More than that, he became her partner, a man who saw her worth and helped her claim it. Together they built an empire, not of greed, but of progress and respect for the land. Their hidden valley was now a beacon, drawing people who wanted to learn a better way to do business. At the center of it all was Lydia, a mother, wife, and leader who had started with nothing but grit and ended up with everything that truly mattered. She had not been given this life. She had fought for it and built it one choice at a time. As the sun set, they went back inside their home, a place created from the most impossible of beginnings. The valley was peaceful, a testament to a life worth fighting for, a life Lydia Crow had claimed as her own. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.